The key slid into the lock, the way it always had, smooth and familiar. But when I turned it, nothing moved. I tried again, slower this time, feeling the metal resist me, as if the door no longer recognized my hand. The porch was quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you the world has already decided something without asking you. I stepped back and looked at the handle, then the door frame, then the window beside it. Everything looked the same, yet something essential had shifted. The lock was new bright against old paint, and in that moment I understood. This was not a mistake. Not a jam mechanism, but a choice someone made while I was away. The neighborhood was still half asleep. Lawns lay damp with morning dew, and the air carried the faint smell of cut grass and cooling asphalt. I stood there longer than I needed to, my hand still resting on the door, as if waiting for it to explain itself. Only after that stillness settled in did I turn inward. My name is Judson Perry, and I am 72 years old. I have spent my life believing that if you showed up, worked hard, and stayed out of the way, things would eventually sort themselves out. I am talking to you now because if you have ever felt edged out of your own life by the people you raised, you already understand more than you want to. I believe that providing was love, and that silence was patience. I believe that keeping the peace meant everyone would eventually remember where they came from. The house in front of me sits on a quiet street in the Midwest, the kind lined with maples and mailboxes that have seen better paint jobs. I bought it decades ago, back when interest rates were high and my back was strong, and every room still carries the weight of years lived honestly. On paper, every inch of it is still mine. In the driveway sat my son Heston's car, parked neatly where mine had been for most of my adult life. The sight of it made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. Someone was home, yet I was not welcome inside. I walked the length of the porch, listening to the boards creak under my shoes. I looked through the front window and caught a glimpse of the kitchen light, glowing softly, the same light that used to come on when I rose early for work. That glow used to mean warmth and routine, not distance. For a brief moment, my mind searched for reasonable explanations. Maybe the lock had been changed for security, or maybe there was a note I had not seen. That hope faded, quickly replaced by the heavier truth that this door had been closed on purpose. I leaned against the porch rail and let the understanding settle. This was not about a lock or a door. This was about who was allowed to belong and who was expected to make room quietly. I thought about the years I spent paying off this place, about the weekends spent fixing what broke instead of replacing it. I thought about how many times I had told myself that being needed was enough, even when being seen would have meant more. Standing there, locked out, I realized how thin that belief had become. The morning stayed calm, almost gentle, which made the moment harder to accept. Nothing dramatic happened, and no voices were raised, yet something fundamental had changed. The door did not open, and with it came the clear understanding that what I was facing was not a temporary inconvenience, but the beginning of something much larger. As I stepped off the porch and looked back one last time, I knew this was no longer just my house being tested. It was my place in my own life, and whether I would continue to wait quietly outside or finally decide what came next. Before the lock ever changed, the house had already begun to feel different. It did not happen all at once, and that was part of why I let it continue. When Heston and Karis asked if they could stay for a while, it sounded reasonable and temporary, the kind of favor families are supposed to offer without hesitation. Heston had lost his position during a round of layoffs that swept through his company, and Karis was trying to keep her work afloat from home. They needed time, they said, and I had space. I told myself it would pass quickly, and I believed that opening my door would keep us close. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Their suitcases sat neatly by the guest room wall, and dinners felt familiar enough. I reminded myself that adjustment always comes with noise, and noise fades. Then small things began to move. A chair shifted from its usual corner to make room for a desk. A lamp I used every evening appeared on a different table without anyone mentioning it. I told myself it was practical. Karis liked order, and she believed every object needed a reason to be where it was. She spoke often about flow and efficiency, about how a space could work better if it were arranged with intention. My intention, it seemed, was assumed rather than asked. One morning I went looking for my coffee mug and found it on a higher shelf I could barely reach. The kitchen worked better that way, Karis explained, and I nodded because it was easier than arguing about something that felt too small to name. Mail began appearing already opened and stacked neatly by the counter. It was never framed as curiosity-only organization. Heston said they were just trying to help keep things from piling up, and I let that explanation settle even when it left a quiet unease behind. My routines started bending around theirs. Breakfast shifted later because Karis preferred quiet mornings, and I adjusted my radio volume down until it became background noise instead of company. I told myself compromise was part of sharing a home. The living room followed next. The couch cushions were replaced with firmer ones that looked cleaner but felt unfamiliar. A side table that held old photos was moved into a hallway where I rarely walked. I noticed my things traveling farther from the center of the house. A coat ended up in a different closet. Books I read often were stacked away because they made the room feel crowded. Karis never spoke sharply or raised her voice. She spoke with certainty, the kind that assumes agreement. She believed she was improving the space, and in her mind, improvement could not be harmful. Heston grew quieter as weeks passed. He came home tired and stayed that way, shoulders rounded, eyes fixed on the floor when conversations drifted too close to tension. When I mentioned feeling out of place, he brushed it off, saying everyone was stressed, and things would calm down soon. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that patience still meant something and that love did not need to be named, to be understood. Each time I swallowed a comment, I told myself it was for the sake of harmony. My bedroom changed without announcement. A dresser drawer was emptied so Karis could store supplies, and my clothes were folded tighter to make room. It was framed as sharing, even though the sharing always seemed to move in one direction. Evenings became the hardest. I found myself retreating earlier, sitting on the edge of the bed, with a book I barely read, listening to voices drift through walls that used to feel thicker. The house still held me, but it no longer held space for me. I began to measure my presence by inconvenience. If I stood too long in the kitchen, I felt in the way. If I asked where something had gone, I felt outdated. Nothing dramatic ever happened. No one yelled and no doors were slammed. Instead, there was a steady narrowing of where I fit, like a room slowly rearranged, until there was no chair left for me. I chose silence because I believed it kept peace. I believed that if I waited, the balance would return and the house would remember who it belonged to. What I did not see then was how silence can teach people what they are allowed to take. By the time the house stopped feeling like mine, I had already given away more than space. I had given up the quiet authority of belonging. That was the erosion I did not recognize until much later, when standing outside made it impossible to ignore. The morning after I stood on my porch and learned the door no longer answered to me, I did not rush anywhere. I sat in my car with the engine off hands, resting on the wheel, letting the quiet do its work. The decision came without drama, the way some truths do when they have been waiting a long time. I understood then that silence had carried me as far as it could. It had not protected me, and it had not softened anything. It had only taught the people around me how far they could go. I drove to a diner a few miles away and ordered coffee I barely tasted. The place smelled like grease and paper napkins, familiar in a way that steadied me. I did not rehearse speeches or plan confrontations because I already knew what mattered. After breakfast, I made a call to a number I had not used in years. The locksmith answered on the second ring, his voice steady and unhurried, the same as it had always been. I told him I needed my locks changed back early before anyone else was awake, and he said he could be there just after 7 in the morning. I waited nearby until his truck pulled up. The sky was pale and the street was still quiet, the kind of hour when most people are dreaming instead of deciding things that will change their lives. I walked up to the house with him, the porch boards sounding the same beneath my feet as they always had. He worked quickly and without questions. I stood beside him watching the old hardware come loose and the new set settle into place with a solid click that felt final in the best way. When he handed me the keys, they felt heavier than I remembered, or maybe my hands were steadier. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cleaning products and coffee. I moved through it slowly, not inspecting, just acknowledging what was there. Then I went to the guest room and began gathering Karis's things. I placed everything carefully, folding clothes, stacking shoes, lining boxes neatly. Nothing was damaged or tossed aside. I set it all on the lawn in the order it had been stored, the way you do when you want to be clear without being cruel. By the time I finished, the sun had climbed higher, and the street was beginning to wake. I stood on the porch for a moment, keys in my pocket, feeling the weight of what I had done settle into my chest. It did not feel sharp or triumphant, only firm. Heston and Karis discovered the change not long after. Their surprise was visible in the way their movements stopped and started again, like people stepping into a room they thought they knew. I listened without interrupting, letting the moment be what it was. When I spoke, my voice stayed even. I explained that this was not meant to punish anyone. It was a boundary drawn because my home and my presence had been treated as temporary when they never were. The impact landed differently on each of them. Karis looked stunned, as if a system she believed was efficient had failed her. Heston looked smaller than I had seen him in years, caught between the life he was trying to hold together and the one he had taken for granted. I did not argue details or revisit old moments. There was no need to list grievances when the outcome already spoke for itself. I told them they could collect what they needed and make arrangements for the rest. As they moved through the house, I stayed near the door. I was not guarding it, just standing where I belonged. The house felt quieter, but not empty. When they left, the lawn was bare again. The street returned to its ordinary rhythm, and the porch light switched off as the daylight took over. I closed the door behind me, not out of anger, but because closing it was the point. I walked through the rooms afterward, opening windows and letting air move where it had been stagnant. The house responded the way old places do when they recognize care. It settled. That morning marked the end of waiting for permission, not to be loud or forceful, but to exist fully where I had always belonged. The lock turning back into place was only the surface of it, a visible sign of something I had finally reclaimed inside myself. Heston came back alone 3 days later, late in the afternoon, when the street was quiet again. I watched him from the front window as he sat in his car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel as if he needed to steady himself before stepping out. When he finally walked up the path, his shoulders were lower than I remembered. I opened the door and let him in without ceremony. We sat at the kitchen table where I had once helped him with homework, the surface worn smooth by years of use. The silence between us felt different now, not tense, just honest. He began speaking slowly, not trying to explain everything at once. As he talked, I saw something I had missed for years. The fear underneath his choices, the quiet shame of feeling like he had failed, and needing to believe he was building something better. It was easier for him to believe control meant progress than to admit how lost he felt. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because understanding requires stillness. His actions had hurt me, and that truth did not disappear just because I could now see the fear behind them. Knowing where harm comes from does not undo it. When it was my turn, I did not lecture him. I spoke from experience, from years of believing that patience alone could fix what silence allowed to break. I told him that forgiveness can exist without reopening doors that should remain closed. I explained that clarity had become necessary for me. I could care about him and still protect myself. Love did not require access, and family did not mean automatic entitlement. After he left, I went through the papers I had avoided for too long. I updated my will and met with an attorney to make sure the house and my finances were clearly protected. It was not an act of anger, but of responsibility, the kind that comes when you stop assuming others will always act in your best interest. The process felt grounding rather than heavy. Each signature reminded me that I was allowed to decide how my life was structured, It was not about control, but about preventing quiet erasure. In the days that followed, the house settled into a rhythm that felt familiar again. I woke early, made coffee the way I liked it, and let the radio play softly without worrying who it might bother. I moved through rooms without adjusting my steps to someone else's expectations. Evenings became peaceful in a way I had forgotten. I sat in my chair with a book and felt present rather than tolerated. The silence no longer pressed in on me. I thought about Heston often, not with bitterness, but with a steady understanding of what had passed between us. Accountability had replaced denial, and that mattered more than apologies spoken too soon. If he wanted a place in my life again, it would be built carefully, not assumed. Standing alone in my living room one evening, I realized the house no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like something I belonged to again. That sense of belonging did not come from winning anything, but from standing firm when it mattered. I had learned that dignity is not loud, and boundaries do not require cruelty. They require clarity, and clarity creates peace that lasts. As the light faded outside and the house grew quiet, I felt steady rooted and fully present in a life that was finally mine to protect.